it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rocky Ruggiero.
Buonasera, buonasera everyone, and welcome one and all. I see a lot of familiar faces out there in the audience, and I'm always flattered that so many of you took the time to join me. I think this is the first time in my career that I've actually been introduced by two people. And so, Bonnie, next year I'll be expecting three, of course, before me. And what Bonnie said is absolutely true. Each year she sort of challenges me to come up with a theme that somehow ties into what's actually going on here at NSU. And inevitably, the light bulb goes off. And today we are talking about this notion of art, power, and politics, because as much as we'd like to think of art as just pretty pictures or beautiful things that make us sigh deeply or what have you, most of the time art in the past had an agenda, or more importantly, those people commissioning the art had an agenda. And the use of art for political purposes goes all the way back to ancient Rome, where in fact we have the Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, commissioning the creation of something called the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, to commemorate the so-called Pax Romana. At least in Augustus's mind, there was peace throughout the entire empire, and this needed to be noted in Rome with the construction of a monument. And if any of you have been to see the Ara Pacis in the last 20 years, you may have admired the beautiful Richard Meyer-designed museum in which it's housed today. And of course, Augustus kind of set the tone for his followers. We have, of course, the great Arch of Titus leading into the Roman Forum, which was commissioned to commemorate Titus's victory over Jerusalem. And of course, one of the images that we see on the inner part of the arch is the carrying of the menorah out of the temple. And then it was sort of off to the races, right? Emperors trying to outdo each other with these monuments celebrating essentially themselves. One of my personal favorites is the 125-foot tall Column of Trajan. Now, I know it's hard in the 21st century to kind of digest this. What is this? It is an architectural and military trophy that commemorates Trajan's victory over a part of the world called Dacia, which corresponds more or less with modern-day Romania, and even more specifically, Transylvania. One of my favorite fun facts about this particular monument is that if you were to unravel the entire relief sculpture around the column, it would amount to something like 200 meters. 2 football fields of sculptural relief, so that people could actually read the military campaign, much like many of us watch documentaries on the History Channel regarding World War II. You remember when they introduced journalists and video cameras into war? Well, essentially, that's exactly what Trajan is doing with this particular monument. Another celebrated. Now, these are all works of art that we go to Rome and admire and take pictures in front of and say, yeah, I saw it too. And of course, one of my personal favorites is the only surviving equestrian monument from ancient Roman times, which celebrates the great philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who commissioned this particular sculpture to celebrate his victory over Germania. Right, that part of Eastern Europe that no one had actually been to before. So all of this great art had an agenda, and that agenda was politically driven. And perhaps the most important of all is the great Constantine. Now, I'm not calling him great. He called himself great, right? Costantino Maximo, and many of you are familiar with this massive head. This is located in the courtyard of the Capitoline Museums in Rome, and I still remember the good old days before the hordes of tourists arrived in Rome. You could actually walk into this courtyard for free. You imagine that? And look at this 1,700-year-old sculpture of Constantine, which people don't realize once belonged to a much larger 30-foot tall statue of the emperor. Now, you go to Florence and you look at Michelangelo's David and your jaw drops. Imagine going to Rome in the 4th century after Christ and seeing a 30-foot tall statue of Constantine. Clearly, this man thought a lot of himself, right? And the idea is essentially using art to glorify, to celebrate oneself and your legacy. And in fact, of all the ancient monuments in Rome with a political agenda, this, in my opinion, is the most important. Okay, when I stand in front of the Arch of Constantine, and a lot of people don't even realize it's there because, of course, they're obsessed with that monument just beyond the Colosseum. I was telling this story. We were down at the Keys with my family for a few days, and I was talking to the captain. We were on a charter, and he was asking, what was the most impressive thing that I saw in Italy? And I said, well, it's probably the Colosseum, right? But I also told him the story that back in the late 90s, there was no admission to get into the Colosseum. Nobody went to the Colosseum. It was just this giant elliptical ruin sitting in the center. It was known for its cats. You remember those days where people went to the Colosseum to see cats and what have you? And then a movie came out called Gladiator. And then it was a mad rush to get into this. It's the most visited monument in Italy today, believe it or not. Some 7.5 million people walked into the Colosseum in 2024. And if you don't know, Gladiator 2 came out a few months ago, so you can imagine that's going to become even more popular. Well, if those people just kind of forgot about Russell Crowe for a bit and turned in the direction of the Arch of Constantine, what they'd realize is that this is one of those what-if monuments. Right? Now, if you don't know, the Arch of Constantine celebrates Constantine's military victory over another Roman emperor named Maxentius. That happened in the year 312 after Christ. And the reason it's so important is that 1 year later, Constantine would legalize a religion called Christianity. And I think most of us know how the story goes from there, right? And my what-if challenge to my undergraduates when we're standing in front of this monument is, what if Constantine had lost that day? Right? I mean, think about how history would have taken a completely different turn, but it didn't. He did win that day, and in fact, this particular monument celebrates it. And I told you before that I'm not the guy who calls him Constantine the Great. He does. Because if you read the inscription up here, Imperator Caesar Costantino Maximo. And perhaps the most puzzling thing about this monument is that when archaeologists began to study it, they realized that a majority of the sculptural reliefs that you see are not contemporary with the arch itself. They were taken from other, earlier imperial monuments in Rome. Monuments that had been built by guys like Trajan and Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius. And so the question is, why was Constantine pillaging from these other monuments? Was he just cheap and didn't want to spend the money himself? Well, the answer instead was that he was a ruler who took power by force. And so by using the art of other emperors, what he's doing is appropriating their legacy. You follow? And so the analogy I use is like presidents swearing in on Bibles that belong to important political or historical figures because they want to associate themselves with that legacy. And that's exactly what Constantine did. In other words, by the time the Renaissance rolls around, there are plenty of precedents for using art for political purposes in Italy. And I know at this point you're all probably expecting me to turn to Florence, right? You all know that Florence is my adopted home. You know that the book that Bonnie mentioned is about one of the 2 Renaissance churches in Florence. But when I get to the Renaissance, I'm actually not going to get to the Renaissance via the city of Florence. I'm going to get there via the city of Siena. I was talking to a couple of you beforehand, and it's weird because in the 10 years that I have lived here in the United States, after having lived in Florence for 20 years, Siena's kind of become my new adopted home. And what I realized is that quantitatively, there's not as much. Florence has much more Renaissance art, but qualitatively, this city packs a punch. And anyone looking at it can see immediately that it's pretty much divided into 2 urban centers. The religious one that's down here, with the beautiful Gothic Cathedral of Siena, but more importantly, the one that concerns us, the political nerve center of the city, which is right there. That is the Palazzo Pubblico and the Piazza del Campo. Now consider that when they built this thing at the end of the 13th century, oops, sorry, where am I? Oh, I'm missing one. When they built this thing at the end of the 13th century, good, Siena was a fledgling republic, a democracy. Now again, living in the United States, we kind of take that political philosophy for granted. But in medieval Europe, democracy was a very rare thing. There were essentially 5 democracies, and all of them were in Italy, and Siena was one of the most important and successful. And it was at this time that the Sienese began to kind of investigate their past. Who are we? Where do we come from? Now again, that might seem like a kind of odd thing to do, but how many of you have taken that Ancestry.com or 23andMe kind of thing, right? It's essentially what happens in the United States, that after generations of the first immigrants coming from a certain family, people want to find out their historical identities. Well, what happens in Siena is that they start looking at their past and they're hoping that they'll find some link back to ancient Rome. Because, of course, everyone knows that ancient Rome was the greatest civilization of all time. But unfortunately for the Sienese, they couldn't find that connection. So as often happens in history, if you can't find the proof or evidence that you need, you simply make it up. And so a legend was born in Siena that they are, in fact, descendants not of Romulus, because we know Romulus's pedigree, right? He settles down on the Palatine Hill. He's the first king of Rome. There are 6 kings who follow. The monarchy becomes a republic. The republic becomes an empire, etc., etc. But the Sienese claim descendancy from, instead, the defunct brother, Remus. They claim that before Romulus killed Remus, Remus had fathered 2 sons, one of whom was named Senus, which is the Latin for Siena. So if you visit Siena and you see the she-wolf and you're scratching your head saying, I thought that was a Roman thing. It is a Roman thing, but the Sienese have appropriated that Roman thing for themselves. You follow? Using art, because this is, you can see this is a 15th century sculpture. It's not an ancient Roman one. That essentially allows them to connect themselves with the great city of Rome. And this notion of democracy, right? Again, it's a big deal because it's a brand new concept. When it came time for the Sienese to build a city hall, a place where that democracy could function, they had no clue what a city hall should look like because there were no city halls. So what did they do? They borrowed the style of fortresses, of castles, of buildings that people associated with power and authority, and they made it their own. So when you look at City Hall in Siena, I think it's one of the most elegant buildings in the world, and you'll notice that it's a tripartite design. You got the big, tallest section flanked by the 2 wings, and those 3 wings represent the 3 branches of Sienese medieval politics, and those 3 branches were legislative, executive, and judicial. Again, people in the United States think that we're kind of the ones who came up with that concept, but that's a concept that goes back all the way to ancient Greek times. And so each wing, the eastern wing, represents the judicial branch of government. The tallest central tower represents which branch? Be careful, everyone. In a democracy, you don't want executive to be. You want legislative to be the most powerful. And so, in fact, the central tower was the torre, actually the torrione, the big tower of the Gran Consiglio, of the Great Council. This is where Sienese parliament met. It was the western wing that was the seat of executive power, the so-called Council of the Nine, because they were so weary of putting too much power into the hands of too few people that there wasn't one executive figure, there were 9 executive figures. And their term of office lasted how long? 2 months. All right? They would put up with the inefficiency of a short 2-month term to guarantee that no one remained in power too long. I mean, we talk of term limits in the United States, but we don't really do much about it, right? Or the fact that if you served on that executive council, you were disqualified from serving again for 3 years to guarantee that we didn't have a kind of oligarchy forming as well. So this is pretty sophisticated stuff to guarantee the survival of their democracy at that time. And when I look at the architecture, again, Bonnie mentioned, I'm an architectural historian by training, so the order, the proportion, the harmony, the direct symbolism of the architectural elements, I'm in my element, right? Very different when I walk down the street and look at Siena Cathedral. Now, of course, this is religion, which by nature is abstract. So we can almost excuse the fact that it took 174 years to build this building. Oops. It took 9 to build that one, right? Because we needed efficiency. We needed to show the people that we can get things done. But when it comes to God, well, a couple of centuries is just a drop in the bucket, technically, right? And at the cathedral, they would start building one thing, and they'd stop and change their minds, and then they would build it another way, and then they would change their mind. But that's fine. It's religion. With politics, it's a completely different thing. And in fact, one of my absolute favorite things about the architecture of the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena is the piazza that's situated in front. I think it's the most beautiful piazza in all of Italy. And it's not just because of the space and the cafes or the fact that this is where they run that horse race that they call the Palio. It's because the radius of this piazza, you can actually see it through the shadow of that tall bell tower, is almost equal to the height of the bell tower. So the plan of the piazza, of the urban space, is directly related to the elevation of the building itself. Now, people don't realize this. It's not like you people are out there with their tape measures, right? Looking to see if they're equal to each other, but you feel it. When you walk into the space, you understand that there is proportion, that there is harmony. Or how about the fact that there are 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 triangular segments to the piazza? And how many guys were sitting on that executive council? It's pretty amazing stuff. I mean, someone's burning the midnight oil thinking about all this, right? Before they're putting it all together. And consider that when they were building City Hall 700 years ago in Siena, zoning laws were being passed, forcing everyone who built in the piazza to use the same building material, which is brick. Uniformity of design, of material, the proportion. These guys get the job done. And it reassured, of course, the people who lived in the city at that time. Now, one would imagine that a similar type of scenario realized itself in Florence. Well, you look at the Palazzo Vecchio, right, which is one of the 2 most important monuments in the city. It was built at exactly the same time as the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. I dare say that it's a bit more fortified looking. This one is more explicitly castle-like than the one that we saw in Siena. This is not a kind of American-style town hall with the banner above the door that says, "Come on in and see your tax dollars at work," sort of encouraging transparency. All this thing is missing is some barbed wire around the whole thing and a kind of moat instead. It's interesting, in fact, that there's one major entrance here on the western side and one over here on the northern side, and all of these windows have had iron bars in them since this building was built, right? And perhaps even more threateningly, when you're walking past, I know some of you will be heading to Florence this summer, you see the arcade, the arches here? Right? The arches that actually line up with all of the windows and doors on the ground level have these rectangular openings inside facing straight down, which were used for the dropping of things such as rocks, boiling oil, spears, and what have you. Can you imagine your city hall working like this, right? And so the notion, of course, is that what they're trying to do is to create a safe space within which democracy can be practiced, to guarantee, of course, the security of those people inside. Well, it worked for a while in Florence, but I think, as many of you know, eventually a family came along whose coat of arms consisted of a shield with anywhere between 5 to 8 balls on it. And that family was named Medici. All right? Over time, what happens in both Siena didn't have a Medici family that took over, but Florence actually did, is that once you start to figure out how the system works, you can figure out how to manipulate that system. And the guy who did that was named Cosimo il Vecchio de' Medici. He's the guy I like to call the Michael Corleone of the family. He took the Medici to Vegas, if you get the drift of my analogy. And what Cosimo realized, I'm giving you the short of it, because otherwise I'll spend the rest of your afternoon talking about this guy. I get goosebumps every time I do. We talk about an election system. Right? It's a democracy. We elect our rulers into power. In reality, it was more of a sortition system, where the sort of election stuff happened at a local level in the neighborhoods, and the names of those people elected at a neighborhood level go into a bag, and then someone covers their eyes and reaches into the bag and pulls out 9 names. So what Cosimo realizes is that if he's working at the neighborhood level, promising people employment, promising people loans, promising people just cash straight out, bribing them to vote for certain people, he's increasing the chances that every time they choose those names, those are guys that are on his payroll. And what happens essentially, it's kind of like fixing the slot machine, so that majority of the time when you pull that lever, the balls will be the symbols that actually appear. And so Cosimo keeps the democracy running. Every 2 months, there's a new city council that's put in charge. But every time that council meets to make a major decision, what happens is that a runner goes flying out the back door and goes into this building, which is Cosimo's home. And he knocks on his door saying, "Excuse me, Mr. Medici, they're voting on that tax hike. What do you want them to do?" And Cosimo says, "Nay." So he runs back, he whispers into the ear of one guy. 5 guys vote no. 4 guys vote yes, just to make it appear like democracy's still working. But ultimately, the puppet master of Florence has become Cosimo the Elder de' Medici. Now, you look at his home. I wouldn't mind having a house like this, but the man was wealthy, so you could sort of pardon it or excuse it, because arguably he's the wealthiest private citizen in the city of Florence. But I think the more astute Florentines would wonder why Cosimo's house looks so much like City Hall. It's made of the same material. It's treated with the same rustication. You see that rough surface treatment that you see? It has the same window type, /4-8, the same number of stories. And so the more observant Florentines saying, "Hold on a second here, buddy. Are you usurping civic architectural imagery for your own purposes, to put it colloquially? Are you stealing town hall's thunder?" And Cosimo says, "Oh, no. Everyone knows that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. What I'm really doing is honoring." Folks, let's say you leave this lecture today and you go over and see the great exhibition, and then you go home and your neighbors have torn down their homes and rebuilt them in exact copies of the White House. I don't think any of you are worried that your neighbors are secretly trying to take over the United States of America, but if they're named Medici, you might want to worry, all right? Because that's exactly what Cosimo was doing. Now consider that this beautiful Renaissance-style palace, which doesn't look very Renaissance on the outside, but it sure does on the inside. Right? When you walk into this building, now remember, this is kind of their global headquarters for the bank. Remember, the Medici family was a banking family. And pretty much every major European leader had money tied up in their bank. And what that meant is that, of course, they could pull strings and could influence geopolitics because of their ties to these particular leaders. So you kind of imagine the home of this banking family to be a classy place. And when you walk into the courtyard of the Medici Palace, which you can do today, I mean, you 600 years of looking exactly like it did when it was built, you can almost hear the Vivaldi music playing softly in the background, the expensive complimentary herbal tea being served, imported, of course, over there in the corner. And what you're thinking, this is one classy joint. Now remember, these guys are rubbing elbows with the creme de la creme of European society. But what I want you to realize, it's not as if it's what the Medici are exposed to that's influencing what's happening in Florence. It's what's happening in Florence that's influencing the rest of Europe. Because when you walk into this courtyard, everyone, instead of that marble statue of Orpheus that you see there, this is the statue that you would have seen. Folks, this raises eyebrows today when it's almost impossible to raise eyebrows anymore. People look at this statue and they go, what the hell is going on with this thing? My undergraduates have nicknamed it the Puss in Boots David. And in a way, I kind of let them do it because it demystifies it. I don't know how a 20-year-old, 21st century undergrad can make heads or tails out of this adolescent, semi-nude figure who still has boots and this funny-looking hat. Remember the hat. It's going to come back later on in this lecture as well. This is as avant-garde as anything that's going on across the street here. You follow? And the fact of the matter, you kind of expect this banker type to be smoking a pipe and wearing tweed, but Cosimo, this guy's got his finger on the pulse of all the art movements of the time. And the most risque of all those artists is my absolute favorite artist in history, whose name was Donatello. Folks, you're looking at the first freestanding nude sculpture since ancient Roman times. I opened with ancient Rome, and now we're back to ancient Rome. That's what the Renaissance is all about. That's a big deal, because you know that through most of the Middle Ages, nudity was a no-no. You can't have nude Virgin Marys running around. You can't have nude saints in paintings. But now what we can do is treat the art in such a way that, yeah, it's still sort of religious, but, all right, because remember, David rejected that armor when he went out to fight Goliath. And if this particular image, which, by the way, has explicit Republican overtones, if you don't know, there's a moral to this story, everyone. David, the shepherd boy, the youngest son of Jesse, represents humility. And that Philistine, that invincible Philistine, represents pride for thinking that he was invincible. So in a way, this sculpture kind of tied in to Florence's stick, if you get my drift. In other words, Florence seeing itself as kind of predestined by God. And if you're still not getting the message, then you walk right past this sculpture, which was here, and into the garden of the Medici Palace to see that statue. Judith, decapitating. Well, let me put it in proper order. After having seduced and inebriated him, decapitating the Assyrian general Holofernes. And this sculpture also by Donatello today in City Hall. And consider that once upon a time, that wineskin that you see poor Holofernes sitting on had wine coming out of the holes that you see at the corner. So you're there collecting your punch or wine during one of these Medici parties. And you're looking up and say, oh, babe, I might want to slow down a little bit because this could happen to me. But you see what they're doing? I mean, they're with one hand, they're taking democracy from the people. And with the other, they're celebrating democracy with the art that they're creating. It's really astute stuff, because ultimately, the Medici are walking that razor-thin fine line between usurpers of democracy and instead champions of it as well. Now, Cosimo's son. It would have been impossible for him to be as shrewd as the old man. There's one Cosimo in 1,000 years, but Piero's pretty good. And he kept that ship going straight, and he learned quite a few things from his father, and he carried on this sort of tradition, if you will, of both celebrating democracy, but at the same time taking it from the Florentines. And it was Piero who commissioned one of the most beautiful hidden gems of the city of Florence, which is the Chapel of the Magi. We're inside the house that I just showed you a moment ago, and there's a private family chapel where every day a priest would come over, he would stand at the altar, and the Medici family members would sit around, hear Mass, and the entire time bask in art that celebrated them. Or to put it another way, they could recharge their ego batteries. The art in this room was meant to remind them how great they were. Okay, so if you're looking for home improvement ideas, you might want to take notes in this particular space. The original door is this one. Okay, that door was added later, but I don't want to get into it right now. So if you saw the title for this lecture, this is actually the figure that appears. This is the third Magus, because the subject matter of the fresco is the adoration of the Magi. All right, the story goes that after Jesus was born, 3 kings, 3 learned or wise men, 3 Magi came from the east. And they brought gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. We all know the story. But does anyone know the meaning of that story? That's a story that was particularly appealing to families with names like Medici and Strozzi and Bardi and Rothschild, because it was a way for these wealthy, let me put it another way, it was a way for these uber wealthy banking families to justify their wealth. Because who were the 3 kings? These 3 really rich guys who brought the 3 most expensive commodities in the ancient world to Jesus. Right? Today it would be Elon Musk. I don't know, who's 2 now? Bezos is 2? Right? And Gates is still 3, I think, right? Showing up at the door and bringing, what do they call those superconductor materials that everyone needs now, right? These sort of things and what have you. And did Mary accept those gifts? There's nothing in the Bible to indicate that she did not. I think she started Jesus' college fund from a very, very early age with those gifts at the time. In other words, the reason they choose this subject, everyone, is because what these banking families, what this banking family, the Medici, is saying, if we do what they did, if we use our wealth to glorify God, then it's okay, right? And in fact, the Medici, every 6th of January, would reenact the voyage of the Magi through the streets of Florence. It would start at their convent, San Marco, and end up in the Duomo. And everyone in Florence would say, how pious of them to reenact this great voyage, when at the same time what they were doing is equating themselves with these particular biblical figures. So he's the youngest of the kings, right? Looks like he rode right out of Lord of the Rings, very elfish looking figure. But over here on the left-hand side, we have a whole bunch of portraits. And anyone who was invited to this chapel would actually recognize these people. There's the Pope, who gave them permission to put the chapel in their home. That's Pope Pius II, arguably the first sort of humanist pope. The artist throws himself in there. Why not? All right? I mean, I'm up there with the Pope. He probably invites his friends over. Hey, look, the Pope's right behind me in this particular arrangement. This is a 10-year-old Lorenzo il Magnifico de' Medici, and his 6-year-old younger brother, Giuliano, who would later be assassinated in Florence Cathedral. This guy is the overlord of a town called Rimini. This is the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Sforza. There's Cosimo. He's still alive. See, Cosimo was very astute. He gave control of the family to his son to kind of ease the generational transition, and he remained on in a kind of consigliere position. You know the scene, and I keep going back to The Godfather, but you know when he's in the tomato garden and Michael goes to talk to him because he needs advice from the old man. And when you look at the old man, you notice that he's riding a donkey. Oh, how modest of Cosimo to ride this beast of burden. And then you say, wait a second, somebody else, who was that who rode that donkey that time into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday? Oh, wasn't that Jesus Christ? You see how it's that duplicity again, where you can accuse him of being either modest or being megalomaniacal in the imagery that he actually uses. And then there's his son, Piero, riding this magnificent charger without reins. You notice he just holds on to the mare of the horse there. And that bridle is covered in Medici imagery. And I'll show you a close-up of it in just a sec. Now, on the other wall, that is where the original door is located, we have the second king, this dark-skinned king, which is in fact a portrait of the Byzantine Emperor John Palaeologus. Who? Well, folks, 20 years before this fresco cycle was done, there was a very important event that took place in Florence called the Council of Florence. They needed to figure out what they were going to do about the Ottoman advance on a city that we used to call Constantinople. In other words, they were banging on the door. The Ottomans were of Constantinople. Every major Christian leader in the world came to Florence When I explain this to my undergrads, I tell them that it was the equivalent of a conclave times a World Cup times a G7 times an Olympics. It was huge. Everyone came to Florence, and who sponsored the event? The balls were everywhere. You can imagine, of course, right? I mean, you know, nothing's really changed under the sun. And so the idea that when you walk into their chapel 20 years later, you see imagery of those world leaders who had been to Florence, who had actually visited the palazzo, who were eating, you know, elbow to elbow with these world leaders. You know, it's kind of the equivalent today of walking into my office and seeing a photo of me with, I don't know, let's say former Vice President Al Gore, right? Just to show you how important I am. That's exactly what the Medici were doing back then as well. Anyway, the imagery that I mentioned before. Look, you can see the Medici coat of arms right there, okay, with the balls and what have you as well. But look what's on either side. Those are diamond rings, ladies. And we all know that diamonds are forever. And if you're not getting it yet, look at the word that appears. Semper. Latin for always. In other words, the Medici aren't going anywhere, right? The Medici forever. The Medici will remain. The Medici dynasty. These are dynastic symbols that you see. Folks, let us not forget that these dynastic symbols are being created while Florence is still technically and legally a republic. So this should be verboten. But the interesting thing is that what the Medici are doing publicly is one thing. What they're doing privately, because that's what this is completely different. You know, these mixed messages. And so if you were invited into the inner kind of, you know, circle of the Medici, they might look to see what your reaction is when you see that word semper on the wall or the diamond rings or what have you, saying, you know, do you smile because you're with them, or are you shocked and probably soon thereafter disappear completely from Florence because of the threat that it actually represents? Okay, let's keep going. This guy is the most celebrated of all of the Medici men. Lorenzo, and he took a page out of the book of Constantine, decided to give himself a superlative nickname as well, the Magnificent. Why not, right? That one wasn't taken. So I'm Lorenzo il Magnifico. This is in the National Gallery in Washington. If you get the chance, it is one of the most surreal experiences. Because if you want to know what Lorenzo il Magnifico looked like, you don't go to Florence. You go to Washington, D.C., and it's life-size. You stare at this thing right in the face. It's like standing in front of the great Lorenzo himself. Now, when he was born, you know, considering we're 2 generations deep into a family that clearly is trying to take over the city of Florence, and much was made of the birth of Lorenzo. In fact, one of the most extraordinary things that you can see at the Met in New York is one of these rare examples of a desco da parto, known as a birth tray. And the imagery on it, now keep in mind that this was actually painted by a very important artist. He's not a household name, but he's important. It's Lo Scheggia, Giovanni di Ser Giovanni, better known as the brother of Masaccio, okay? And considered that this was not just a painting that would eventually be hung on the wall. Right after the birth of the child, it would be used to serve the mother sweetbreads and reinforced wine and cheese. We have images of these things actually being used as serving trays. But look at the image. Fame, you see at the top. And all of these knights swearing loyalty to the figure of Fame with outstretched hands there as well. Remember that funny hat that the Bronze David had on? Look, there it is again. Look at Tex over here with that 5-gallon hat on his head, right? This is another throwback to ancient Greek times. So clearly the idea is that this kid is going to be destined for great things, because we can see this image of all these figures celebrating his birth, right? Everyone come and now swear. Kiss the ring is the expression that we would probably use today. And I know it's dark, but you might be able to make out here on the backside the Medici coat of arms, along with that of Lorenzo's mom, whose name was Lucrezia Tornabuoni, which is another important Florentine name. The 3 ostrich feathers, which were thought to have the kind of magical qualities, all inside of a diamond ring. There it is again, inside of which is a ribbon or a banderole, and you can barely make out, but there they are, SEMPER. Whichever way you look at this birth tray, everyone, this kid is here to stay. That is what this is all about. Now, Lorenzo would be educated by the greatest minds of the Renaissance and would eventually put together a kind of group of, let's call it his cabinet, if you will. And these members of Lorenzo's cabinet, Marsilio Ficino, Cristoforo Landino, Angelo Poliziano, Demetrius Calcondila, these were the creme de la creme of the humanists. We would call them classicists. They were educated in Greek, in Latin, in Hebrew. They knew ancient philosophy and literature and culture as well. They were the guys you went to find out about ancient Greece and Rome, and they created the kind of fertile environment for artwork like this to come along. All right, now one of the most celebrated paintings of all time, and we're all so busy trying to take a selfie in front of it that we kind of forget that in addition to the beauty, the innovative aspect of this painting, everyone, is that we have introduced mythological, well, let me put it another way, pagan subject matter into the mainstream of European art. So, come on. Think of the art that we see today. It's nearly impossible to shock us, right? Folks, if someone saw a painting of a large pagan and nude goddess hanging on your wall during the Renaissance, all it took was a quick phone call. 1-800-Inquisition hotline, right? To get you into a lot of trouble. And so people ask, well, then how come it happened? Well, because the patron of this painting was not Lorenzo, but Lorenzo's cousin, another Lorenzo de' Medici. And remember, the Medici were bankrolling the institution that could get them into trouble. They were bankers to the Pope. So if they got word that, the Inquisition was snooping around, they just call the Pope, they speed dial on his personal number, say, call the dogs off. And if the Medici start using this type of subject matter as the language of power, because that's what if you were using mythology, if you were using pagan themes in your art, then you were kind of part of that in crowd that got away with doing things that the rest of us would not get away with. And not surprisingly, this kind of opened up the floodgates to mixing now this language between both pagan and Christian subjects. And we turn to arguably the greatest statue ever created, right? The David. I can't count the number of times that I've stood in this museum under the statue and have been asked, why did Michelangelo call him David? Why not Bill, Jack, Fred? And, at first you're like, huh? And then you realize, well, I think the sculpture is just so famous and iconic that it's easy to forget that this is a Renaissance representation of a biblical figure. This is not, as some of my undergraduates think, a sculpture of a hot guy that Michelangelo casually named David instead of Fred. All right? But because the language, this doesn't belong, does it, to the medieval art of Christianity? I mean, they're completely robed. If you see a little neck, it was scandalous, right? This belongs to this world, doesn't it? Even though technically it's 20 years later. And that's what Michelangelo does. He blurs the lines now between that Christian and pagan, between that Renaissance and classical world, so that now even the Republic will use this imagery. Folks, I want you to realize something very important. When Michelangelo carved this sculpture in 1501, the Medici were out. It happened in a rather convoluted way. It took a religious fanatic by the name of Savonarola to come along and really stir things up in Florence in the 1490s, but then Savonarola was hanged and burned in 1498. The Medici had been kicked out, and we were celebrating the last glory age of the Florentine Republic. So instead of putting this statue of David, remember what the story means? Humility over pride. Instead of putting the statue where he was supposed to go, which is on the back side of Florence Cathedral, the decision was made to put him where? By the front door of City Hall. He's like a guardian. He's like a sentinel, a message to the Medici, don't come back. We kicked your butts one time, we're going to do it again. Just like David slew the Philistine. And of course, when it looks like this, that obviously gives it additional points, if you will. But that is why the statue was put there in front of the building that represents democracy. So what's happening, we're really stirring up this brew now where it's pagan, it's nude, it's democracy, it's monarchy, it's everything coming together. But what I want you to realize is this, is that by the time that Michelangelo carves the David, the power center of Italy is shifting south, away from Florence and to the city of Rome. The papacy has finally gotten its act together. Now, why would the papacy have to get its act together? Because remember, for most of the 14th century, the papacy wasn't in Rome, it was up in France, in Avignon. And it took them the better part of a half century to finally consolidate power again. And the guy who put the definitive nail in the coffin and said, look, the popes are back, is that gentleman, Giuliano della Rovere, who when elected pope in 1503, took the name Julius II. What business does a pope have naming himself after Julius Caesar? Now, clearly there was another pope who did it, the first Julius, right? And he's doing it as well. Well, this pope was known as the warrior pope because he spent more time on horseback leading troops into battle than he did standing at the altar celebrating Mass. And so Julius looked to Florence, he looked to the Medici to see what those guys had done, and he borrowed a little bit of their magic by bringing Michelangelo to Rome and said, I want a little bit of that visual language that you're using, blurring the lines between the pagan and the Christian. And so Michelangelo goes to work for him on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Right? How many of you have seen the movie Conclave? I watched it on the plane coming down here. You know that they were not in the Sistine Chapel. Let's start with that. But they did a pretty good job reconstructing it. That's what this is. Everyone, the 30 to 35,000 people a day who walk through here and gawk up at that ceiling, I think fail to realize that this is where we elect popes. This is the most important chapel in the Catholic world. So what business is there having what I like to call the Chip and Dale calendar all across? Think about how inappropriate this is, everyone. Mamma mia. I mean, it's inappropriate today. Can you imagine in the 16th century to see this? Look at that. I mean, I know it's inspirational. I mean, in addition to just the gratuitous male nudity of Adam, who presumably didn't have a pair of jeans on when he was made, but look at God. That, from the moment I saw that God the Father image, I was a kid when I saw it the first time, I said, that's not the way I imagine God. I kind of imagine God looking like Santa Claus, right? I mean, more grand paternal. That God looks more like Zeus, doesn't he? Folks, we elect popes in this chapel in the mix of gratuitous male nudity and pagan imagery, but this is the language of power. So even the Pope is willing to close an eye to the morality of the very religion that he's the leader of, to express power. Because what's happening is that these popes are becoming more concerned with politics than they are with the religion that they remember. The popes were secular rulers as well. Or this beautiful painting, this great painting by Raphael, the great assembly of all the classical minds. We have Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras and Euclid and everyone else. Huh? We're in the Vatican. We should have saints and what have you, but no, we have these great classical minds instead, because that's what the Renaissance is. It's the rebirth, it's the reflourishing, of course, of this ancient world. And then popes like this guy, Leo X. He's the son of Lorenzo Magnifico, second-born son In fact, Lorenzo, this guy, imagine playing chess against this guy. Lorenzo realized which way the wind was blowing, and that if that whole Semper and the diamond ring, and Florence is small fish. He wanted big fish. So his second son, Giovanni de' Medici, was made a cardinal at the age of 13 and went on to become Pope Leo X in 1513. This is the guy who at his coronation said he used the royal we. Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. Right? Not surprisingly, it was under the reign of Pope Leo X that something called the Protestant Reformation took place in 1517. And one of my undergrads properly described Pope Leo as looking, one said piggish, and the other one saying he looks more like a gangster than a pope. Pope Leo, just to give you an idea of where we're going, this is one of the paintings this was an apartment of Julius, but then he ended up moving in. The story of Peter and Paul appearing and turning back Attila the Hun. And in fact, you see Pope Leo here. But the curious thing is that when Raphael began the execution of the painting, he wasn't Pope yet. Pope Julius was still Pope. And so he was actually painted here. See if you can see it. As a cardinal, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici. But while Raphael's working on the fresco, Pope Julius dies, and Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici becomes Pope Leo X. So he paints him in again as Pope. It's the same guy as a cardinal and a Pope. And I've always imagined the conversation, Raphael trying to be a little political and discreet, saying, well, Pope, you're already in the painting. And the Pope saying, well, put me in there again. I just can't get enough of myself, right? And the idea of using these great artists and using their great art to celebrate themselves. We get down to Pope Paul V Borghese. The great family Borghese, et cetera, et cetera. This guy, you talk about being at the right place at the right time, is Pope when they're working on the facade of St. Peter. So he gets to sprawl his name right across the facade of the most important church in the entire Christian world. Look, Paulos V Borgesius. And of course, when you see it on the front of St. Peter's, you think that he built the entire church, when in fact he was responsible for this little piece. So now we're starting to see popes really outdoing themselves. And this guy, Maffeo Barberini, Pope Urban VIII, who commissioned a 25-year-old sculptor named Gian Lorenzo Bernini to create a 10-story tall, 96-ton bronze baldachin to stand over the high altar of St. Peter. Wow, isn't that great of him? In honor of St. Peter. And in order to do this, a lot of the bronze was stripped off of the porch of the Pantheon, one of the greatest ancient monuments in Rome. Well, better than paying for it, right? And in fact, the expression in Rome is what the barbarians didn't do, the Barberini did, and the Barberini popes. And so the idea of, finally a pope who's doing it to celebrate St. Peter, until you realize that on the lapels of that great canopy, we have this rather distinct symbol, these three bumblebees, which in fact is the coat of arms of the Barberini family. So anyone, this is a Jubilee year, and they're expecting 40 million people to go to Rome, and presumably they're all going to go to St. Peter's, and presumably they're all going to go to the high altar of the Basilica, and presumably they're all going to know that the Pope who was responsible for building this thing was in fact Pope Urban VIII. So yes, for the glory of God, but also just a little bit for the glory of me as the Pope, right? And this is essentially what is going on at the time. And art, power, and politics, and clearly now even religion has been superseded by this particular phenomenon. So folks, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and it's always great being back.